When we think of the Easter Rising of 1916, we tend to think of the post office, the GPO, and also we tend to think of it in terms of characters like, say, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, these iconic figures. But for a couple of days in April 1916, the Great War came to Dublin, and the events of the Rising throw up no shortage of kind of smaller vignettes and more obscure characters. And one of those is the guy I'd like to talk to today, the guy who's relevant to this laneway, and who was actually born quite close to here in North King Street. Now, the gentleman in question was a guy called Sean McLoughlin, who had joined the Irish Volunteers in the North Inner City, and he was only about, say, 21 at the time of the Rising, and initially him and his colleagues had the job of occupying the Mendicity Institute, which is up on Usher's Island. The thinking was that would be a good way of interfering with British troops as they entered the city from the Royal Barracks, what's now Collins Barracks. Now, McLoughlin had the job of shuttling back and forth between the Mendicity Institute and the GPO over the course of the week, but as the fighting got more intense, he ended up in the GPO for, well, for the duration, you might say. And when that building finally went on fire and was abandoned, he came to prominence leading the actual breakout from the GPO as the building was abandoned at the tail end of the Rising. Now, McLoughlin had heard that there was an attempt to basically break out of this building and go north. The idea was to make their way to a jam factory called Williams and Woods, which is on King's Inn Street. Now, this breakout was being led by Michael O'Rahilly, the O'Rahilly, who came out with this rather swashbuckling line about how he had helped to wind the clock and would come to hear it strike. Now, when McLoughlin got wind of this, he was pretty certain this was a suicide mission, or at least it was suicidal, because in his kind of wanderings through the city, he'd realised the extent to which the British had thrown a ring of steel around the city centre. Now, he tried to follow O'Rahilly and the 30 men that O'Rahilly had taken with him up this laneway here. But as he did so, he apparently looked back and saw basically everyone else who was in the GPO suddenly running out of the building towards him and towards these laneways. Now, they came in here, and the thinking was he could kind of, you know, keep moving north into the city, base themselves elsewhere. But as they came into this laneway, it became obvious that they were trapped. Now, they came across Henry Street, came down Moore Lane, and as they came to this junction here, they noticed that there was a building that seemed to be getting peppered with gunfire. They thought they were being attacked from it. McLoughlin, in an account he wrote of this, refers to a white house, which is roughly that building right there with the, well, it's white and purple these days, but I think you get the impression, at the bottom of the laneway. Now, they broke into the house and realised that, well, the building wasn't actually occupied, but what they thought was gunfire from the building was the ricochets of bullets from gunners at the end of Moore Lane, just down here, firing down this way. Now, this street would have had various wine and spirits merchants and also a mineral water factory at this time. So they broke into the factory, got some kind of wagon, put it across the mouth of the laneway to give themselves some cover, and kept on going. Now, there were also British barricades at the end of Moore Street, which posed another issue. So when they came to the terraces, just on Moore Street itself, they smashed into the buildings. Now, I suppose when this happened, you saw, you know, I suppose some of the amateurism of the volunteers. I mean, these guys weren't professional soldiers by any means. There's one story about how one volunteer shot through a doorway and killed the teenage daughter of the family living there. Another volunteer tried to smash his way into a house with a shotgun, but he used the butt of the shotgun on the doorway and blew his own throat out. Now, when they got into these buildings, they holed up in here. And it's at this stage McLoughlin came to prominence. He was appointed by James Connolly as a commandant of the volunteers, so more or less promoted on the spot. And he began to try and get his colleagues to tunnel through the houses, smash through the wallways. Apparently they smashed through one level, then smashed through another, so you didn't have a tunnel running all the way through. They got down to what's now, you know, O'Rahilly Parade, where they realised that they were at the edge of the British cordon and that they were quite certainly trapped. Now, some of the more senior figures were involved in this. I mean, McLoughlin was in there with the likes of Pearse, Connolly, who had been wounded leaving, you know, outside the GPO, Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Harry Boland, who wasn't executed but will come to more prominence later on. Now, when McLoughlin and the rest of those who had been in the GPO holed up in this terrace, he eventually took charge of the decision to surrender, or at least the arrangements for surrendering. They marched out of here with their weapons down to the end of O'Connell Street, Sackville Street as it was called. Basically surrendered there and were kept overnight in the Rotunda. Now, the day after this happened, once the fight was all over, the prisoners that were held in the garden of the Rotunda were taken out to the west of the city to Kilmainham Jail and to Richmond Barracks. And it's there that quite an unusual thing happened to McLoughlin, because as he was being brought into the barracks, he was grabbed by a British soldier, by a British officer, who, you know, asked him his age. He told him he was 20, 21, and the officer told him he was too young to be an officer. Now, McLoughlin had certain insignia on his uniform that had been given to him after he had been promoted on the spot by Connolly. And this British officer ripped these off, told McLoughlin he was no longer an officer, and basically pushed him back into, you know, the column of prisoners being imprisoned. Now, in an account that McLoughlin wrote about this, he says that that man, that officer, was no enemy, and he seemed to credit that officer with saving his life. And had that British officer not ripped those insignia off McLoughlin's, you know, uniform, there's a good chance he would have been shot as well. So in a way that makes, you know, McLoughlin one of the most senior survivors of the Easter Rising. And this was an issue that kind of would haunt him in his later career, because in the years after the Rising, McLoughlin would have joined the Volunteers, but he also became an active and enthusiastic communist organiser, both in Ireland and in Britain. And he felt that his politics were held against him in later life as he tried to get a pension off the Irish state. I mean, during the Civil War he was described as the Red Flagger from Dublin. He eventually died in obscurity in Sheffield in 1960, but he left these kind of fairly detailed accounts of what had happened, perhaps in an attempt to vindicate himself. But if you bear in mind that you associate someone like Eamon de Valera with this intense, rigorous Catholic conservatism, if you look at someone like McLoughlin, someone for whom the period after 1916 was the opportunity to stage a very, very different revolution, and to think that a guy like that who had played a pivotal role in these events died in obscurity, it's a little reminder that, you know, these events, the Easter Rising, the events around then, they're a little bit more complex than necessarily meets the eye, and, you know, obscure he may be, but he's no less interesting for that.